Today I will be introducing colonialism and cultural transformations. That's chapter 6 in the current edition. If you bought the older edition, it's chapter 16. And you can tell by the authors that bringing it up to chapter 6 is an indicator of the importance of this topic to anthropology. Colonialism or globalization in general is something that anthropologists have been talking about a lot longer than other people. Now I think largely because of the environmental effects of globalization. We're all beginning to talk about it much more. So let me start with European colonialism. You are all, or many of you went to grade school in California, and you remember fourth grade and the Spanish missions. That is pretty much a good example, and I'll go back to that example because you're all very familiar with it here on the West Coast. But the tricorned hats, the 1700s as well, Thanksgiving, all of that sort of stuff. Other images that might conjure up is conquest on the high seas, and the relationship to the mother country. Even things like in India and Canada, still being Commonwealth countries of the United Kingdom, is something that you still see happening. Imperialism is now considered an uglier word, but it was often a word used with pride. The empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and such. Okay. So colonialism itself, we can think of it, and I have images up here. One of, England being with like spider hands grabbing all these other nations, and another picture of Africa that was pretty much carved up by European interests. The idea is, bigger, more powerful countries, and I mean bigger in terms of having more power, not geographically bigger in many cases. Taking control of the interests of smaller countries, less developed. As you can see from this map of Africa, most of the borders of Africa have been defined by Europeans based on the interest they had in each of these countries. They went there, they took natural resources, including people, of course, slavery. At this point, there's only 2 countries in Africa whose borders has been defined by Africans, newer ones in Eastern Africa. The amount of land that was reserved for indigenous peoples in many of these cases was extremely small. As the chart that I took from the book, it's table 6.2 in the new edition, illustrates how little land. You can see this going around. The case of the California missions might be a better one. That vast chunks of land was ideally supposed to be set aside for indigenous peoples. That was the plan. That sounded very ethical, and it never really happened. And if you can think of, the United States cases, about Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, further illustrations of the reservation system. Often what ended up happening is the indigenous folks got the worst chunk of land, and European settlers got the best. So there's different types of colonies that you're reading about in your book. There's, they call them exploitation colonies, just very directly, we're here to take stuff. Maritime enclaves, which had a benefit, for both sides. England was very strong in that area. First Spain and Portugal was, and then England later. Setting up networks, kind of like how Walmart does it, actually. They will send a truck to a Walmart in Poughkeepsie and to drop off, toys or whatever. But at the same point, they'll fill it up with something else before they drive it back. I remember when Walmart first started, that was one of the clever business strategies they had. So they're never having empty trucks driving around. Maritime enclaves you can think of as like that. Europe connecting, you get spices from the east and you trade it for maybe leather in the New World. And then you go back to Europe with, both spices and leather. Settlement colonies is, when actual people are moving in, typically European people, to these areas. And that you can think of as the typical North American version of it. Missions, like I said before, the California missions intended to convert these people not just to a religious way of living, Catholicism, but also an economic system, so that they would be part of the Spanish Empire, and they would like horse riding and like fancy saddles made of leather, etc. The exploitation colonies, are some of the darkest ones where it was directly, we're here to take stuff. You can think of the sugarcane crops of the Caribbean as an example of that. Growing sugarcane and cutting it is extremely difficult work. It's very hot. It's very uncomfortable, to some extent dangerous. And rather than the Europeans doing it themselves, they brought Africans, from the continent of Africa to the Caribbean to do this. This is when sugar was pretty much invented. Same time around coffee was invented. So you'd have bitter coffee, you'd sprinkle some sugar in it in Europe, and it was quite a kick, in the 17th century. So sugar was like gold, and building it, at any price was kind of the intention. As I said, I explained the maritime enclaves already. Here's I've included a picture of it, including, West Africa, West Indies, North America, and then back to Europe. And in each case, you're buying and selling goods from all these different trade centers. In this case, the home countries might indirectly profit from this. But for the most part, the receivers of colonialism aren't really getting a benefit. The settlement colonies, here we see a picture of Jamestown in Virginia. Permanent locations of Europeans. Often, a lot of the Europeans, why would they want to leave Europe? Religious persecution. A lot of Germans came because they wanted to, practice a certain type of religion that wasn't welcome at home. If you're a second-born son, you don't get any land in Europe. And so, why not sail the high seas and get some free land? Or if you're a prisoner, in Europe, and you're given an option, hey, we'll send you to the colonies, and you'll be free after, a few years of service. So different varieties of reasons that get people to just pick up and move. These policies ended up really dark for the locals who were here, the Native Americans. Basically, the Trail of Tears is as depicted in this painting right here. And Jackson's Removal Act. Andrew Jackson was a president, and he was really harsh on the indigenous peoples of North America and the United States. Get them out of the way so Europeans can come and have this land. That's pretty directly the plan. Slavery in Africa was another issue, and again, that's often one of the darkest issues. African slaves in Europe and North America is some of the ugliest versions of slavery that our world knows. At least history knows. Maybe in prehistory there might have been others, but like Islam always, originally approved of slavery, but it was more like a caste system. If you were a slave, you were in this family and you took care of them, but there was a lot less of the harsh, beatings and everything in those contexts. In fact, at one point, an imam, or a caliph, one of the, like a pope king of the Islamic world, was technically a slave. So in a sense, slavery is not always meant the same thing, but we can see its worst cases, in a sense, I think, is African slavery in the New World. It's some of the most ugly and inhuman versions of slavery. Now, in North America, we see, like I said before, this westward, settlement plans. The depopulation of Native Americans. It's only a small portion of Native Americans who died by, the U.S. military shooting them. You can think of, those sorts of years. The many more of them were actually killed by disease, and I have a chart that's coming up that will explain that. Other reasons why the New World was connected to the fur trade, and this is more of an East Coast event, not as much a West Coast event, or Northern California. Russians came through Northern California and above there for fur trade. But in California itself, there's not many furry animals. But this was a big deal, the fur trade for Canada on the East Coast, in terms of why people would want to come here, just to do trade. You do 10 years of fur trade and then move back to, France or England as a motivator. As I said, the Spanish colonization system was another major one. I have a picture here depicting, the New World, from Mexico all the way down through Latin America, to all of South America, depicting predominantly Spanish, some Portuguese, but predominantly Spanish dominion over this whole region. Their system was a bit different from the British and French versions. This idea of, I'll mention it in a second. The one was economiendas, was an economic system, where Spanish landlords was basically a rich Spaniard, a nobleman, would be granted land in the New World. And it's temporary, everything's temporary in that sense, but maybe, for 50 years, or your whole family can live there forever. And connected to that is this idea of servitude, by the locals. So, the locals will end up taking care of the land, and that wasn't negotiated, with the indigenous people. They were just told to do this, enforced by soldiers, overseen by priests, and then profited, by settlers and the home kingdom, Spain in this case. Mita is another thing that's more South American. This didn't happen as much in the sort of mission idea and the Central American idea of that you're familiar with, because it came originally from an Incan economic system, of kind of I will owe you a couple of years of service, to do something, so I can get married or whatever. Or if, one Incan, if an Incan peoples took over another South American group, they were in servitude. It was quasi-slavery, you could say. Kind of like indentured service, you might think of it as. Haciendas, the big estates, that lands, directly owned by the Spanish settlers. Eventually, some of these lands were granted directly to Spanish citizens. And the intention there with intermarriage, the hope was always, and this worked a lot better in Mexico than it did in the mission systems of California. The hope was that you would intermarry, with the indigenous peoples and more gradually take over, Mexico, as Mexico is. It's a product of a great deal of intermarriage, Spanish and indigenous peoples. And that was just part of their plan. The Spain in the Americas, the colonization system, again, the mission system, a great deal of already. There's a nice picture here of, maybe it was, I forget who it was, one of the early guys, Vasquez, maybe, who came and, greeted the Indians and, then the whole idea, if you've ever been to any of the missions, the mass graves, the forced conversions, and the ostensible slavery. Here's the population chart that I mentioned earlier. The estimated, we don't know because, history means recorded history. And before Europeans came to North America, no one was recording history. No one was writing it down. So we don't know the population prior to European arrival. So these are all just estimations, and it's incredible, in terms of by the time the Europeans arrived, let's say in the middle, in the Midwest or something, Native Americans have already been decimated by smallpox. So there's far fewer of them there. And so that's another thing that illustrates, around the globe, how many people were radically just flat out killed, due to colonial interest.